Hello, and welcome to another edition of Up Close on METV. I'm Charles Clapsaddle, Station Manager for Manatee Educational Television. And on this edition of Up Close on METV, we're very pleased to have with us the Director of Historical Resources for Manatee County Government, Ms. Kathy Slusser. Kathy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We've been trying to get you on this program for a while, and I'm so glad that you took time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
But on this edition, we're not only going to talk about your great career as part of the historical resources, but we're here to talk about another thing that you do with your career, and that's you're a published author, author of two really well-received books that we're going to talk about today. And I can't wait to hear all the details about them.
Thank you.
But before we begin, tell us a little bit about your background as the Director of Historical Resources. You're responsible for quite a few things here in Manatee County.
I am the Director of Historical Resources for the Clerk of Circuit Court's office, and a lot of people are surprised that the clerk is involved in historic preservation, but my boss, Chip Shore, is very interested in local history. And when the county was looking for a place to put a historical resources department, it went into his office. So we have 4 historical museums, Manatee Village Historical Park, the Palmetto Historical Park, the Manatee County Agricultural Museum, and the Florida Maritime Museum, as well as the Manatee County Historical Records Library that includes all of our county's governmental records going back to 1855.
1855.
That was when our county was organized.
Yeah. Well, and first I must tell you, having been to most of these facilities, they are so well restored and so well preserved. The Manatee County should be very, very proud of its historical preservation.
Well, we are very lucky that we've had such great support for historic preservation in our county. I think a lot of it goes back to our agricultural roots. Farmers need to know what happened in the past in order to plan for the future. And so we have a lot of people interested in historic preservation and history in Manatee County. And
you have been with the clerk's office for almost 30 years now, is that correct?
Well, actually over 30 years.
Over 30 years.
30 years in February.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, you know, you've been so instrumental in helping, you know, preserve not only Manatee County history, but Florida history in this area. It's really a significant achievement, and congratulations for helping Manatee County preserve its history.
Well, thank you. It's been a joy.
Well, tell us a little bit briefly about, you know, your responsibilities, not only of preserving that, but also you're instrumental in making sure that the history portion of each one of these facilities is accurate, is understandable, and is really accessible for people.
I am so lucky to have such great staff. We have wonderful staff at each one of our sites who are very interested in presenting our history both accurately but also in creative ways. We have everything from special exhibits to programs like Spirit Voices. It's held at Manatee Village Historical Park.
And that's coming up, isn't it?
That's coming up. And people actually reenact the lives of the folks that are buried in that cemetery. And it's a great way for people to learn about our history in a first-person kind of situation.
Well, and I think it's a wonderful idea when you initiated this program. And now Spirit Voices in what year?
Spirit Voices is in its 4th or 5th year.
4th or 5th year, yeah.
And it's grown. It's going to be 3 weeks long this year.
That's fantastic. And again, congratulations. And what a unique way of trying to, you know, make history come alive.
That's exactly what we try to do. We work to make sure that it's not something just static, but it's something people can participate in and experience.
Well, congratulations again for doing so much for Manatee County as the Director of Historical Resources. And Mr. Shore, I'm sure, can be very proud of not only your efforts, but the efforts of the entire Historical Resources Division in making sure that these facilities are accessible for the public to know and understand.
We work hard to do that, and we're very glad that we're successful and that people are enjoying learning about the past.
Well, and that brings us to one of the many reasons why we asked you here today is that you are, aside from all your many other tasks and duties and responsibilities, are also a very successful author of 2 books and a third one on the way, which we're going to talk about. But it's a wonderful series that we want to talk in detail about, and it's called From a Heavenly Land. And first of all, can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of how you became a writer and an author?
It goes back to when I was in middle school. When I was in middle school, I hated history, believe it or not. History was taught in a very unappealing way, very boring. Memorize a list of the presidents in order with their terms of office, the names of battles, and it just was not at all appealing to me. If you had asked me, I would have told you I hated history. But I was reading some novels that were not really appropriate for a 13-year-old. Remember the ones with the half-naked woman laying in the arms of the bare-chested man?
I think they called them romance novels.
Yes, romance novels.
So you were, as a young...
As a 13-year-old,
13-year-old, were reading those, and what happened? Somebody caught, you caught, obviously, a teacher's attention.
A Sunday school teacher saw that my choice of reading material, and instead of taking it away from me and telling me how awful I was, she put in my hands the novels of Eugenia Price, who wrote historical fiction based on St. Simon's Island and St. Augustine and places, local history woven in with these fiction stories. And my parents saw that I was interested in those books, so they took me to St. Simon's Island on vacation one year. And I was walking around the cemetery at Christ Church, which is one of the main settings of some of her books, and started seeing familiar names on the tombstones. And all of a sudden, it was like a cartoon light bulb went on over my head, and I thought, these are real people that I've been reading about. This is history. And as precocious as it might seem, as a 13-year-old, I made the decision that someday I was going to be a historian, but I was going to teach history in a creative way that people would enjoy, like Eugenia Price's books.
Well, what a remarkable story that was. So here you are, a young teenager, who became enthralled with Eugenia Price's books, and then having an opportunity to see a little bit of living history, you decided, I want to go in that route.
That's what I did. I ended up getting my bachelor's degree and master's degree in history. And my parents moved to Terracea Island in 1979 while I was in college, but they did tell me where they were going. And they bought the homestead of Julia and Joseph Atzeroth on Terracea. And when I was a senior in college, I had to do a paper on some historical event or person, and it had to include primary sources, which are things written or produced during the time period that you're studying. So I decided that I would do it on the Atzeroth family. And I wrote an article that eventually appeared in Tampa Bay History magazine, and historians all over the state suddenly knew of my interest in this family and began sending me information that they would find if they were in the National Archives or the state archives. And gradually, between my own research and the research that they provided, over about 25 years, I had a whole box full of information about the Atzeroth family. And then I had to decide.
From all these different sources, from different places,
yes.
and things, little scraps of information,
Yes.
or perhaps a story or a newspaper article. That information you were just accumulating
Yes.
over this period of time.
Letters and documents and all kinds of newspaper articles, and then I had to decide what I was going to do with them.
And
I went with my career goal of trying to present history in a creative way, and so rather than just do a scholarly article or book, I decided to write historical fiction and write a novel about Eliza Atzeroth's life.
And the name of the book is From a Heavenly Land. Eliza's story.
Eliza's story.
And that's the first in the trilogy of
Yes.
books that you're going to write about the Azeroth family. So for those in this community, tell us a little bit about the Azeroths. And this is a family that was actually here. They lived in this community. Tell us a little bit about their general background.
The Azeroths were German. They came from Germany in the 1830s. There was a wave of immigration to United States from Germany. One, it was encouraged by the federal government because the German citizens were well educated and craftspeople, and so they were the kind of people that you wanted to help start new settlements in the country. But also there was some religious persecution going on in Germany during that time. The Azeroths were Lutherans, and Lutheran churches were being closed, and pastors' homes were being taken. People were being put in jail because they were Lutherans. And so the Azeroths came during that time period, I think, both for the economic opportunity, but also for religious freedom. They eventually ended up on Terracea Island. They had planned to stop in Pennsylvania, where a lot of Germans were settling,
Right.
and maybe go out west. But Julia had some health issues, which the doctors kept telling her she would be better if she went somewhere south where it was warmer.
Warmer.
So they were in New Orleans for a while, and finally they ended up in the Tampa Bay area about the time that the Armed Occupation Act was in place, where people could get 160 acres of land for free, as long as they cleared 5 acres, built a house, and lived there for 5 years. And so they arrived on Terracea Island in 1843.
And Florida was a frontier.
Yes.
It was wildlife, Indians, disease, all of those things that one would expect in a frontier. It was a very hard, there was a great deal of hardship.
It was a very hard life, particularly for a woman. As you mentioned, there was problems with the wild animals, there were Indian attacks, diseases like yellow fever. There were also hurricanes that would come completely unexpected. They didn't have the kind of warning
Unannounced,
system.
yeah.
That's right. But for a woman, it was also particularly hard because they were isolated from society. There were no churches or schools or places that they could go and be part of a community. And so it was a very hard life, particularly for the women.
Now, as the family grew, Eliza was the firstborn?
Eliza was their first living child. They had 2 children while they were in Germany, 2 boys who died before they left Germany. There was a typhoid epidemic. I don't know for sure. They may have died of typhoid or scarlet fever. But when they came here, they had just 1 child, Eliza. Eventually, they adopted Julia's niece, Mary. So they raised 2 girls in the wilderness.
And it must have been just a tremendous hardship for a young girl to grow up in an area which was still frontier, no neighbors, no schools. It must have been a tremendous hardship for a young girl. It
was hard for the whole family. They went back and forth between Terracea and Tampa. There were things that pulled them back to Tampa for short periods of time. For example, Julia Azeroth borrowed some money from the commander of the Fort Brooke that was in Tampa, and she couldn't pay the money back. So he said, if you come and work for me as a housekeeper, we'll consider your debt canceled. So during the times that they were back and forth in Tampa, the girls did get to go to a regular school.
Oh, well, that's good. And that was a big part of their life then,
yes.
going to school.
Yes. And then Joseph had trouble getting his homestead papers for his land on Terracea. Some of that was most likely due to religious reasons. Some of the settlers in the area didn't really care for the Azeroths because they spoke German and because they were Lutherans. There's documentation by people attesting on his behalf that that kind of persecution was going on even here in the United States. And so eventually they moved to what we call Palmetto today, right where the Regatta Point Marina is, and they had the first store on the north side of the river. Julia purchased that land at an auction in Tampa. So they had their impact back and forth between Tampa, Terracea, and also Palmetto.
Well, and as you gathered these facts and did your research and accumulated the material, the ideas started formulating, and how do I tell this in a way that really reflects not only the hardship, but also that person. And tell us how that came to be.
Well, that's where the fiction comes in. I knew what they did. I knew where they went. I knew what land they bought or the cattle that they bought.
Right.
But I didn't know why. I didn't know what they were thinking, why they made the decisions that they made, particularly Eliza. Eliza's life was a lot like a soap opera. She had a lot of really awful things happen to her during her time here. And I didn't know what she was thinking. So I had to put myself in her place. What would I think? What would I do? Why would I?
As a young girl, a young girl going back and forth, having these unbearable hardships, thrust upon them. So, and then you kind of developed this kind of an affinity, I would think, for Eliza.
Yes. It's been very interesting doing both the books on Eliza and on her mother, Julia. The way your brain works is that I could go to bed at night puzzling over why. What would happen next? Why would they do what they did? How am I going to advance the story next? And in the morning, I wake up with this whole story just... I have to sit down and write it down right away before I forget it.
Well, that's the mark of a good writer, I think, is that accumulation of great ideas. But I would suggest also that, here you are, this historical researcher, somebody grounded in history and grounded in facts, on one hand, and taking that. And on the other hand, you're taking these hard, actual facts and creating this individual story about this young girl. And so you're melding both worlds kind of together, and that makes for fascinating historical fiction.
I kind of equate it to a forensic anthropologist.
Exactly.
Who finds bones but doesn't know what the person looked like. And so they look at the bones and then they imagine, what was this person like? What did they do? What were their likes and dislikes? And that's basically what I do as a writer.
And I think also you're a little bit of a detective too, because finding that material or that letter or that newspaper clipping that could give you a little more insight into the path that they take. Now, Eliza's story is a sad story. She goes through many, many difficult things, but there is also, that story of great redemption and great hope, that even in the face of hopelessness. And tell us why that was important for you to sustain that.
I am a person of faith. And I can't imagine that Eliza or Julia, for that matter, could have gone through the things that they went through. The loss of children, the loss of marriages, having to move frequently, the isolation they experienced. I can't imagine that they could have gone through that without faith. And then knowing about their strong Lutheran background.
Right.
So throughout the books, in addition to the history and the fiction, is the story of a woman's faith journey. Eliza's coming to believe in God and who God is, and what he expects from her, but what he also can do for her, the hope that he can give her. And Julia's story is very similar too, that I just don't see how they could have done what they did without having some kind of faith.
But being able to capture that, with the prose that you have, based upon this historical backdrop of the difficulties and the hardships, and at the same time this understanding of this young girl growing up in a very, very difficult environment, it is really the type of book that really is inspirational.
Yes, and that's what I set out to do, resting on my mentor, Eugenia Price, who is long dead, but who left us some incredible stories, true stories about real people, about their faith and the things they experienced. And so that was my goal, was to do something in a modern world like Eugenia Price did 20, 30 years ago.
But what you've done is taken something and made history very vivid. because these were actual circumstances that happened. The hurricane or the Indian attacks or the disease that kind of permeated. These were actual things that occurred that are documented, and that did occur. And taking that into the life of these individuals and saying this, because of the way they are, would have been the natural reaction.
Yes.
And it's very stimulating to do that. Now, the book itself was an accumulation of a lot of hard work and a lot of effort. You accumulated all this material, you formulated these thoughts about each one of your characters, but it took you a while to get that into a book form.
When I started writing Eliza's story, it only took 9 months to get the book written. And then I did some editing, and I let a few friends and family read it. And I sent it off to a regional history publisher, thinking that they were going to call me up as soon as they got the manuscript and say, "This is our next Pulitzer Prize winner. We've been waiting for this manuscript our whole lives."
As well they should have.
Well, they sent me a form letter saying thanks but no thanks. And I got my feelings hurt, and so I put the book away, and it sat in my computer for 7 years.
7 years.
7 years. And in the beginning of 2013, I made a life goal list. Some people call them a bucket list. And at the top of the list was to get Eliza's story published. And my husband, who is not in the publishing business, but he kept telling me, "You need to self-publish it through Amazon." And I said, "You don't tell me what to do. I'm the author. I know what to do.
I know.
You don't have to tell me anything." And he said, no, I'm telling you, you need to publish it through Amazon. And I started doing some research and found a woman in Colorado who shepherds authors through the process
Wonderful.
of self-publishing through Amazon.
Well, what a great opportunity to do that. So, and hats off to your husband for for pursuing that. But it's a difficult path because you felt that this was a story that was well worth telling, and something that an audience would react to, and you really have had that kind of reaction, haven't you?
Yes, I have. It's been very well received. Eliza's story, the first week that it was out, was in the top 10 for Amazon's Christian historical fiction.
Well,
in the first
congratulations on that. And I think it continues to kind of resonate with people that are trying to find that historical background, this historical fiction that Eliza's story is. With the success and the meaningful story of Eliza's story, you decide, well, there's more to be told. There's another portion of this, and then you went to Julia's story. Now, you briefly talked about Julia, the wife and mother, difficulty, having to work, having to move, losing, some children at a very young age. This had to be a little more difficult because her story predates Eliza's story. So how did you develop the research and the background for this?
Julia's story does go back in time. I wanted to tell about how the Atzeroth family got here. And so I had to do research in German history and immigration history, things that I was not at all familiar with. In my whole career with the clerk's office, I've been telling students, don't research on the internet. The internet is evil. Go to the library, look in the newspapers, and then I found out how much you can find on the internet. So I was able to find ship records and all kinds of interesting things. I found where Joseph, Julia's husband, comes to New York. I found the ship and the date that he arrived.
Really?
So there's all kinds of interesting things available on the internet that you can find in your pajamas on your couch.
But I must tell you, I mean, in order to get there, you have to be very knowledgeable and know and sift through hundreds and thousands of things to get to that one item.
Yes.
That might be of significance as you carry on in your research. It's not like you just push a button and there's the information. It really requires like a trained mind, a historical perspective on things to get that amount of detail.
And I was very fortunate that I had Joseph's naturalization papers that told me the date that he came to New York. So I was able to look at all the ship records for the ships arriving on that date. So I did have a little bit of
A little bit
before
of
I
it,
started.
But even so, it's a difficulty. And then also, I think you mentioned, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, because you had to go back to Germany
Yes.
to find more about Julia. And that in itself, increases the level of difficulty, I would think, because you're dealing with a whole new set of books and a language that you're not familiar with in order to kind of research to the material that you need.
Yes, and I'm very grateful to the volunteers and historians around the world who document these and put these sources and things on the internet for people like me to use. If it had not been for them, there were a lot of little pieces. It's like putting a puzzle together, and there's a lot of little pieces that I would have missed if not for the work that they have done.
Well, putting the puzzle together is a great thing for historians to do, but also for a writer to put those pieces together in such a fascinating story is really a great and unique thing for you to do, Kathy. But I'm curious a little bit. Eliza's story and Julia's story, while there's similarities, there's a lot of different. Tell us what you found that those strengths and weaknesses between Julia and Eliza.
Well, Eliza was born into adversity. She was 3 when they arrived, so Florida was all she knew, the Indians and the hurricanes. And so I think she was not as shocked as Julia was when Julia arrived, having been raised in Germany, even though she was an orphan. Life was easier, and then to all of a sudden come to a place where things were so very, very different. So I think for Julia, it was probably more of a shock than Eliza.
Well, and one thing that you mentioned too is the fact that they came for religious freedom, and then were still subjected to some religious discrimination even when they were here, which made it even more difficult.
Yes, it did.
Coming to a land where they were told it was, religious opportunity, but that wasn't the case.
No, it was not the case. There was an established congregation in the village of Manatee, which was the original settlement here. The Atzeroths were isolated on Terracea, but they came looking for a Lutheran church, and there was not one here.
To be found.
And there was probably a disagreement between the Atzeroths and the established settlement over slavery as well. The Atzeroths took in a runaway slave, purchased him, and quite possibly set him free. The Lutheran religion would most likely not have had them be slaveholders. So there was a problem. They were brought to court for harboring a runaway slave.
Were they?
So there were a lot of things that were related to their belief system that made them not fit in with some of the other people that lived here.
So they had their own issues that they were dealing. They were, they had to deal with a lot of adversity, not only from the elements, but also within the community, society.
Yes.
So, the one thing that I'd like for you to talk a moment about too is that these are two very strong women. Very independent, very self-sufficient, and kind of ahead of their time a little bit. Did that impress you? I mean, did you want those women? Did you see those women developing into that?
Yes, both of them are. It's documented that they were very strong women, and that's the very interesting thing that is happening right now as I write my 3rd book. I'm writing about Caroline's story.
And tell us who Caroline is.
Caroline is Eliza's daughter-in-law. And when Caroline married Eliza's son, Will, she moved into the house with Julia and Eliza.
Ooh.
So I have these 2 very strong women who've been my heroines in my other 2 books, and now my new heroine is encountering these 2 women, and they're not treating her very nicely.
Well, and because she's so different?
She's different. She's more modern. She was raised in New Jersey. She had a high school education, which neither Julia nor Eliza had. She marries Eliza's only son. Eliza has 8 children, and only one lives to adulthood, and that's Will. So she's very protective of her son. So life is very hard for Carolyn too, although in much different ways.
But in a different way. Yeah, I mean, maybe, you know, and during that period of time, life in general became a little bit easier, but at the same time, there's still a lot of difficulties to overcome. And a lot of that is just, you know, the different types of social settings that they find yourself in.
One of the things that I think has been most interesting to me as I've done my research as a historian and been writing the books is that relationships and people don't change. Our settings change, our times and events around us change, but people don't change. And so while we might look at people who've lived in the past and think, oh, they were so much stronger than we were, they were so much smarter than we were, no, they just lived in a different time. We have the same kinds of difficulties that we face, the same kinds of decisions that we have to make.
Exactly.
And so that's why I think it's relevant for us to learn from these three women about the things that happened to them and the decisions that they made.
And I would suggest to you too is that, you know, that those values that these women have, you know, courage, honesty, hopefulness, faith, all of those things are criteria that, you know, kind of transcend time and place. You know, each one of them has that same kind of basis for building themselves on. And, you know, and Caroline's story is not quite done yet. Is that correct?
I'm about a third of the way through Caroline's story. Caroline has her own troubles that she faces, and so Caroline hasn't quite figured herself out yet. Eventually, Caroline moves to St. Petersburg, so about half of the book is set in St. Petersburg and half of it is set here. So I'm working my way through.
So I think you're going to wake up in the morning and you're going to have these full-fledged ideas. Oh, now this is what's going to happen.
That does happen. Like full conversations between characters, and it's like I been talking to them in the night.
And I'm sure they talk to you as well. But the remarkable thing, I think, Kathy, and you know, this is, you know, to your credit for being, you know, not only, you know, involved with history for 30 plus years, is that all of these stories are so grounded in actual history, events that occurred, an Indian attack, a disease, towns springing up. All of this is routed in those things that actually occurred. And as you read through the books, people say, oh, I've heard that story, or somebody told me about that. So you have that kind of like very familiar feel, and that's what history brings you.
Yes. For example, Caroline's family comes and lives in a town called Erie. And now today we don't really know about Erie unless you've been traveling through Parrish and you've been on Erie Road. And now people, I hope after they've read Caroline's story, will think there was a town named Erie and it was located right here, and understand, you know, that there's a lot that happened here before we arrived.
Well, I think a lot of people think, oh, well, you know, history only goes back like 2 or 3 years, but we have this rich, vibrant history of not only this area, but all of Florida, that really is great for not only stories, but for people to have a deep and abiding understanding of. So we're kind of winding down a little bit, and I want to talk to you briefly about another thing. As you were writing, and you know, Liza's story sitting in your computer system for 7 years, I think I'm sorry to hear that, but you know, now the success of it is, you know, is more than overtaken it. What was the best part of developing these books?
The best part of developing the books has been when the story starts to flow, and maybe I'm at a point where I think, okay, that chapter's done now. What's going to happen now? And then I start working on the next chapter, and before I know it, I have 3 or 4 more chapters, and the story just kind of flows out of me. That's the best feeling.
And it becomes pretty natural to you. It really comes natural to you. Well, here's the turnaround. What was the hardest part? What was the hardest part?
The hardest part was stopping.
Because I guess there was a lot more you could have put into all of these books, correct?
Actually, part of Julia's story was originally written to be part of Eliza's story.
Oh.
And when I had to cut the book down because it was just getting too unwieldy, I decided that, okay, this will be part of Julia's story.
Okay.
We'll tell Julia's story now.
Well, I'm sure, and Kathy, first of all, congratulations on this. This is wonderful. And, it's wonderful for Manatee County to have that, to have this kind of understanding of the books and the settings and everything, to have really that understanding. But more importantly, it's also a rich story of some really remarkable women told in a way that's very inspirational about how their faith has sustained them through, difficult times, and at the same time has enriched them as well. But I would say there's many more stories to come, and I would suggest that if you ever go from the Director of Historical Resources, perhaps you'll find that time to do other stories as well. Is there something that you would like to do that you haven't tried yet? Maybe a children's story, or some kind of other historical undertaking?
Well, there's a couple of projects I have when Caroline's story is done.
Okay.
And
can you share those with us?
Yes. Some teachers have asked me to take portions of Eliza's story and make them child friendly.
Ah.
So like a youth edition of Eliza's story. So that's kind of in the works.
Oh, good for
and
you.
then there are two characters in Eliza's story that people have really attached themselves to and they want to know more about.
So there might be
So there
an
may be some
offshoot.
spin-offs about those characters.
That's a great, and then maybe a spin-off from there, because history is so rich and filled with many great things, and with your imagination and depth of research that you do, there's a great many more books, I hope, with you to come.
Well, thank you.
All right. Kathy, I can't thank you enough for
Thank
joining
you.
us today. If people want to find out information about your books and where they can purchase them, how can they find out?
They can get them from Amazon. They're also
Amazon.com.
Amazon.com.
And just type in, From a Heavenly Land,
Yes.
Eliza's story or Julia's story, correct?
Yes, and they're also available for Kindle
Okay.
from Amazon.
Oh, that's great.
Or locally, they can get them at the Manatee Village Historical Park or at the Manatee County Agricultural Museum or the Citrus Place on Terracea. They carry them as well.
Well, that's great. So locally they can get them, or somebody who, if you're watching now and you feel that this is something you want to learn a little bit more about, you can go right to Amazon.com or you can go to the Historical Village and have a wonderful day there and buy Kathy's books at the same time.
Yes.
Kathy, again, continued success with your books, because I think there's really a void that you're filling with historical fiction, and whereas that rich, vibrant feel of living history that you kind of impart, and you have wonderful characters to talk about, and continued great success with that, and also continued success with the Director of Historical Resources. Manatee County is very fortunate to have someone of your caliber and expertise and knowledge here looking out for the history of Manatee County.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on this special edition of Up Close on METV.